Man, where do I start with this one? I think I'm going to start with saying that one of the things that was interesting to me about Longest Journey was if I had known it was going to be a trilogy, I would assume, oh, it's just a standalone game. Because while there were certainly things left open and there was certainly room for continuation or like a sequel or whatever, Longest Journey felt like one of those stories that ended in a way that you could chop it off there and it wouldn't actually be worse for the effort. This game, by contrast, feels like the exact opposite of that. I can't even imagine what it was like when this game came out and I was like, alright, here's the end. Huh? Most people refer to this as a cliffhanger, and that's certainly valid, but I'm trying to think how to put this. There is a type of cliffhanger. There's a narrative structure to stories, and some stories clearly are designed in a way where they could continue, but they don't have to. And then some stories are structured in a way where they have to continue, or it's an incomplete story. This one feels like that. This is an incomplete story until it is continued. Now, I happen to know there's a third game coming, so that's nice. But that brings me to the second thing. It was one of the biggest impressions that came to mind when I was playing through this. This doesn't feel like a sequel. I don't mean that in a bad way, though. What I mean is, The Longest Journey felt like... I'm trying to think of a good example. Screw examples. Screw analogies. I can't think of one. The Longest Journey felt like, here's introducing the setting. Here's the beginning here. Here's the characters. Here's the concepts. Here's the world. Here's the rules. And here's a big, doomy plot. I would say this feels like a Empire Strikes Back, but it doesn't, because Empire Strikes Back was a clear follow-up to A New Hope. But this feels like a new story set in the same setting. In almost every way, it feels completely disconnected to The Longest Journey. And again, not saying that is a bad thing, but I find that amusing considering how many times I'm going through this and it's like, hey, look at this thing from the previous game, or here's this character from the previous game. They even did flashbacks. Now, from what I understand, the purpose behind that was so that people wouldn't have to play the first game to at least get the gist of what happened in the first game here when playing through the second. And I've heard the comment many times by people that you don't have to play Longest Journey to enjoy Dreamfall. Or, yes, this one. 2. You don't have to play 1 to enjoy 2. And I tend to agree with that assessment. But that brings me very neatly to my next point. I think I enjoyed 1 better than 2. This is great, actually, from my perspective. You have any idea how often I am accused of only liking older games because I have nostalgia, or only liking newer games because I don't appreciate older games? Yes, I'm accused of both. It's really quite funny. I played Longest Journey up to, like, the first 30 minutes, as I described. I played up until that frickin' key puzzle, and then stopped, right? So I have no nostalgia here. I have no preconceived notions. Yet I still liked the first one a little bit better. And I'd like to explain why a little bit, before we go into anything else. And it boils down to gameplay, of all things. I mean, there's something else I'll talk about in a moment, but the first game, as I described, very much felt like lining up a series of dominoes and then knocking them over. That's what the gameplay felt like. And with the exception of maybe 2 puzzles, the key one being the notable one, I had no real problems going through that game. I was like, okay, this and here and that. And April herself was a very likable protagonist that I very much enjoyed for many different reasons, as I already mentioned, the whole normal person O'Brien effect thing they had going on. And I very much enjoyed the world building and the thematic significance that was an undercurrent for most of the thing. Then we get to this game. Now, I am not saying this game's bad, by the way. Let me make that clear. I really hate it when people throw words into my mouth like that. I'm not saying Dreamfall's bad. I still enjoyed going through it. But, first of all, I found the gameplay to be far inferior. It felt less like an adventure game and more like... kind of like a visual novel. Except still not. I felt like I was playing a Telltale game without the dialogue options of a Telltale game, which is one of the things I enjoy most about a Telltale game. If anything, it reminded me a lot of those really old, I don't know what the genre is called, but when you'd go explore like a haunted mansion, there was a lot of horror games about this where it's like you have to go, Shadowgate on the NES, for example, or Alone in the Dark on the PC. This is the stuff that this game was reminding me of. You go around, you kind of interact with the environment, not really, and you just kind of make things happen. But there's no real puzzles per se, except for the literal puzzles. In other words, rather than setting up a series of dominoes, I felt like I was reading through a story and then occasionally having to solve, a like, here, play the Sudoku thing. Well, okay. Okay, now what? And I didn't enjoy that as much. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, I'm just saying I enjoyed that less. What I am saying bad is the combat sections. I get the idea of wanting to include combat in the game. It actually makes a lot of sense, especially for this particular story, which is far more serious and far more focused on conflict and war in general. But at the same time, it was terrible. It reminded me of a lot of the really, really old combat in, like, 80s and 90s games, where it's like, health. It's I didn't enjoy it at all, to be blunt. I found it to be actually antagonistic towards my enjoyment of the game. Now, let's talk about the things they did do awesome, because they did do some really good gameplay choices in this one. First of all, the multiple viewpoint thing, bear with me, the multiple viewpoint thing was awesome. I'm one of those people that actually really enjoys it when we see, this is the story, but we see it from Bob's, and then Bobina's, and then Bobette's, and then Bob's, and then Bobette's, and then Bob's, and then Bobina's story parts. It's still one story, but we keep shifting viewpoints. When done well, I rather enjoy that type of storytelling. But how does that relate to gameplay? There is a brilliant scene, I can't remember the name of the chapter, it's like Crossroads, or Convergence, I think was actually what it was, where we play Zoe, Kian? God, they almost never say his name. Azadi dude. I wrote down his name here, but I don't remember how they pronounced it, because they almost never say. So Kian dude and April, and we just kind of, all three of them are within like a few hundred feet of each other, and we keep hopping back between viewpoints. And there's that one awesome scene where April and Kian actually talk to each other, and you control both characters. That's such a brilliant idea. I'm a little surprised more games don't do that. Now, by the same token, there's a reason for that. At least I'm assuming there's a reason for that. Because that sounds like something that would be a nightmare to write. Because you have to write multiple dialogue branches for multiple people and how the conversation can go. Not just roughly, but in specifics. But it's so awesome being able to sway the conversation in whatever particular way you want to, because you're playing both party members. But at the same time, it reminds me a little bit of The Witcher, the games, specifically Witcher 3, because that's the only Witcher game. Hear me out. We're not playing Johnny McMegadude, right? We're not playing Bobzilla 3379, right? No, we're playing Geralt. But we still get to choose his dialogue options. What I mean by this is that is a specific type of acting, of role-playing, if you will. Choosing, you have a pre-existing character, but you can slant them. You don't have total freedom to do whatever, but you can slant them in a given direction, but you still have to adhere to their core personality. So that kind of writing for an option where you play multiple characters who are talking to each other can work. If you're playing, a completely pre-generated character who can have any dialogue option in the world, talking to another completely, new original character, then that's going to be a mess and probably wouldn't actually work nearly as well. At the very least, you'd have to spend way more time designing all the various dialogue trees. Regardless, I very much enjoyed that. This game, in many ways, feels like a far more serious game than the previous, and this is the final reason why I enjoyed the previous game more. The previous game felt like a Dragon Quest game. For those of you who didn't actually watch my previous Rumination, it's silly, we're making fun, and then slowly becoming more serious and dark. This game is serious and dark and horrific all the way through, with a couple of interventions of humor, almost all of which comes from Crow. Oh, and Blind Bob, he was funny. And that damned elevator. Sorry, the air is dry in here. So let's talk about the setting a little bit. First of all, this is going to be interesting speculating on some of these things, because I have a feeling that the third game is going to have some of the answers for what I'm going to postulate. And this is even more true now, since this game so clearly is part of a story, rather than Longest Journey, which was a conclusive story. So the setting has... I wonder at what rank, at what level, for lack of a better term, the AI is in this setting. How competent, how sapient and sentient the AI is. We see fairly advanced AI in the, and I wrote it down, the Matillas? The Watillas, that's it, the Watillas. But I don't actually know how advanced they are, or if they are subject to droid effect or not. Because remember, droid effect requires sufficient advancement to be able to self-improve and learn, similar to what a human being will do. I'm sorry, I will be right back. Ugh. Hopefully I'll remember to edit this out. I guess I don't need to edit it out. Just closing my door, trying to get rid of some of the white noise in the background. Very professional, high quality standards here on the Lowrunner. We try to have the most professional experience possible while not actually having a studio and being a one-man operation. In all seriousness, I do try to be as professional and as high production value as I possibly can. I hope you at least agree with me on that, and if you don't, that's okay. Moving on. The Dreamer, the frickin' thing, and the way it works, is a far more interesting and realistic take on the holodeck than I've seen in recent memory. The holodeck, when you really sit and think about it, is magic. I mean, it's such an insane amount of technology, and the amount of tech required to make it function is ridiculous. The actual technical manuals that have come out for Star Trek trying to explain the holodeck have only introduced new questions, because there's just so much there that we're just told, just go with it, right? Let me give you just a very basic problem here, okay? You've got 15 people on a holodeck that's got maybe about 30 feet diameter, okay? 15 people on there. Now one of them, now you're playing let's say you're in the holodeck and you're doing a World War II simulator, and one of them is in the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, right? Stalingrad, fighting, the good fight. And one of them is in Berlin, and one of them's in Britain. How do you make that happen? Now, the technical manuals try to claim that through a complicated series of... but it doesn't take into account physical motion or certain other elements of basic physics that would have to be solved in order for that to work. So we all just kind of accept that the holodeck is magic and move on, right? What these things do accomplishes effectively the exact same thing as a holodeck without having to magic, because it's basically entirely in your own brain. It just makes you in control of your own thoughts, your own dreams, to such a severe extent that it is effectively a holodeck. Because that is one of the primary points of a holodeck. It's not just the fact that you can go and experience all this stuff, it's the fact that you have control over it. You can run a holo novel, sure, but you can also edit it on the fly, live, infinitely. And that's what you can do in your own dreams. Now, of course, there's something more sinister in this case, but we'll get to that. There's another thing I have here in my setting paragraph. I usually divvy it up, gameplay, setting, and then specific plot stuff, and then character stuff, and then themes at the end. There's 3 locations that are related to each other at this point. Only 2 of which I have a name for. The Winter area, which is where Faith was, and Storytime, which is where Westhouse went and where Zoe ended up at. I have nothing but questions at this point. Now, I understand that they were kind of going with based on some of the background material, a dreams are the source of reality kind of mythos thing, which I don't like. I'll just go ahead and be honest about that. It's like, okay, yeah, we dreamed reality into whatever. Yes, where no one has gone before, TNG Season 1 reference. Now, I don't care for that, but I have to use that as far as my speculation goes. So what it sounds like is these are the places that are, shall we say, the source of the dreams that are leading to the remainder of reality, the source of the stories, if you will. I don't actually have much else other than that, but it sounds like Zoe and Faith, for whatever reason, for whatever their connection and whoever the heck, I mean, it's obvious that Helena is Zoe's mother. I picked up on that, but I'm not sure why when a company is researching dreams and basically crafts these people, all of a sudden they have access to this dream thing. Because that implies that the dream has taken control of the dreamer, which is getting really, really, really meta at that point. I'm just going to walk away from that. Yeah. So I get that, and I get all of that, but what I have to question is, what the heck is the undreaming? That was the one question that was just burning in my mind the entire game. This game actually pulls a Scooby-Doo twice, actually. And in both cases, I'm pretty sure I can now speculate on the resultant thereof. Remember how I mentioned last game that Brian Westhouse felt like a character that had more of a role? Well, I was right! I think he's the undreaming, or was possessed by the undreaming. Let me explain. Brian Westhouse is in Stark. I shouldn't say the real world. He's in Stark, and then he's suddenly sent into Storytime, the in-between realm. Now, he actually kind of referenced that back in Longest Journey, so okay, I'm with that. And then he encounters something called the Undreaming, which is this horrible Cthulhu-esque thing. Okay, I'm with it. Then, based on what we know, nothing really new happened. He goes through Longest Journey, and we suddenly see him here, and he's like, oh, hey, what's up? But I want to bring up one other thing, because I'm going to explain that Scooby-Doo thing in a moment. There's this guy named the Prophet, who is acting like he can give orders to the leaders of the Azadi, like he's some bigwig amongst the Azadi. He is actually the one who advised the Six, who are the Six Empresses who actually run the organization. So, who the hell is he? Well, this is how the Scooby-Doo thing comes in, because the Scooby-Doo trick is introduced and then forgotten. That's what that actually refers to. Now, Scooby-Doo usually does that as part of a mystery. It's like, who done it? You know, who done it? And the actual suspect is the person they introduced right at the beginning and then just walked away from and never mentioned again. It's a fairly typical trick when it comes to that kind of thing. It's a way to obfuscate from a writer's perspective. Because, hey, here's Bob, hey, what's up? Yeah, I've done that myself, actually, in a storyline I'm not going to spoil for you because I hope to actually write it someday. But there's a character in that storyline who is literally the third character you ever meet in the entire story, and he's actually behind a lot of the horrible stuff that's been happening, right? It's a fairly common trick. So the Prophet is like, hey, and he's gone. No other references. I mean, that's not true. He's referenced several times, but you get my point. It's just, and then we have the Undreaming. Both of them are referenced quite a few times afterwards. And then there's the fact that Westhouse is acting a little bit weird. And they pull the writing trick again in a different way later. Because there's a scene where he basically coerces Crow into showing him where the hidden enclave is, which happens to be where the White Kin is hanging out. Right? And yet, for all the insidiousness of what he's doing, it's completely covered over because Crow is shticking the entire time. The entire scene, Crow is bumbling around and being silly and laughing, generally injecting humor into the work. So if you're just looking at it and not really processing it, not really thinking about it, it's like, oh, they finally decided to add some levity to the game by reintroducing Crow. And in fairness, that is what they're doing. It's not actually a lie. It is merely a deception. At least I think it is. So they inject some humor with Crow, which completely covers the fact that Westhouse basically just kind of like, oh, yeah, I totally have access to a frickin' airship, and I totally have the ability to go do this, and oh, yeah, that's right, you know where to go, isn't that, Crow? Why don't you help us find that place, Crow? And then we'll go there. That'll be awesome, Crow. Thanks, Crow. And then we see the White Kin get attacked by someone she recognizes, or at least it sounded like she recognized him, in a place where the last shot we had of Westhouse was the typical villain overlooking shot of, oh, that's interesting. So yeah, I think the Prophet is Westhouse, and then I think that he's not actually Westhouse. I think he is, and probably always has been, possessed by the Undreaming. That brings me to my next point. Again, this is just the realm of speculation. I can't wait to play the third game and be like, wow, I am so terribly wrong about everything. This game really seems to be leaning towards the direction of dreams equate to or create reality. which leaves us with the idea of exactly what the undreaming can be, because it's all there in the title. The anti-life equation, for anybody who's a fan of DC. That kind of a thing comes to mind. Or simply death, or evil, or the ancient primeval, or whatever. A lot of settings have something that is basically the antithesis of life, or the antithesis of creation, right? And that's what it feels like the undreaming is. Now, given that, if we are to follow my chain of logic, which I know is getting a little long at this point, but if we were to follow all of that, that would mean the undreaming is actually behind basically everything that's happening, because there is literally no denying that, at the very least, the directors of this game want us to feel that there is a connection between, I don't remember what they call it, the biological computer that's running the DreamNet thing, and the tower that they're building in Arcadia. When DreamNet finally actually goes live, the tower goes... And, of course, that's just at the ending, though. There's actually several other correlations, like when April touches the thing and it goes... And that leads to another thing back in Stark. My point is there's quite a few scenes that literally cut back and forth. There's even a section where you play as April going through the tower, Zoe going through the biocomputer area, and it just cuts back and forth. So it's clear, at the very least, they want us to think there's a connection between those two things. Given the fact that the Prophet is therefore involved in the creation of the tower and wants it done at a certain time, deadline, hint, hint, it therefore is logical to conclude that whatever the hell the Undreaming's up to, it has to do with that tower and that thing. So what the hell's the Undreaming up to? Now, this is entering wild speculation range, but I think that the people, when they're dreaming, aren't just dreaming. I think at least part of them is going to Arcadia, and I think that's what it wants. I also think that the Undreaming is the one who is hunting down the Kin, because the Kin, for whatever reason, can at least put up a resistance against the Undreaming. So, yeah, things haven't even started getting bad yet. Now, this is all, of course, speculation. I really have no idea. I can't wait to play the third game, and it's like, it's actually, the Undreaming's actually, I don't know, it's a Yoshi. Yoshi! And now Nintendo owns this video. Couple thoughts. First of all, the static. I actually put some notes here speculating on the static was, and then they, of course, explained what the static was. Ironically, I had the thought, I actually have the note right there, Ghost in the Shell. It was one of the first things I wrote down. It was actually the third theory I wrote down about the static. Hey, I was right. I find myself interested to notice that they didn't actually explain how that worked. They didn't have to, really. We can put the dots together however we want to. Maybe it is literally just her memories put into a biological computer. Maybe it's the fact that she is actually within the Storytime dream realm. Winter being connected to Storytime, right? So maybe that's what's going on. It seems clear, though, that for whatever reason, Faith was helping Zoe connect to Arcadia. And that brings me to my next point. The difference between shifters and dreamers. Now, I didn't have a term for that second part. It isn't until the end that it's pretty much confirmed that Tattoo Guy in Story Guy Time says, Zoe, you are a dreamer. Doesn't define what that actually means. And given the fact that she wasn't in Arcadia and could just vanish instantly without having to open a portal to shift between the two worlds, and given the nature of how that works, I think she was projecting. I think she was sending a image, if you will, an avatar, perhaps, of herself into Arcadia and never actually left. Which makes sense because she never actually left the bar, right? And she never actually left when Guy Dudeface, God, I can't remember anyone's names in this game, was watching over her. The guy she was getting infatuated with. So it's logical to me to assume that she was just, okay, yep, I'm here. And that would explain a lot of the nature of what happened and why it happened. But what it does not answer is why she can do that. And what, of course, is the difference between... Or I shouldn't say what the difference, because we've already established what the difference is, but what exactly can a dreamer do other than project? Could she project anywhere? Because, remember, Arcadia is just another planet, really. It may be in a different dimension or whatever, but it is a separate planet, still connected to Stark, right? Could she project to the moon? Could she project to Arcadia's moon? I don't know. I'm just curious. I also find myself wondering if she could project to the Guardian's realm. This is as good a time as any to talk about the Guardian, because I just want to say I frickin' called it. Now we are facing a threat of significantly greater proportion than the destabilization of balance. Granted, that was a decent level threat, but the consequences of that were always kind of vaguely defined. We weren't actually sure what would come of that, if the two worlds simply remerged. Oh, excuse me. Or if balance was destabilized. I mean, we know what would happen if McAllen had took it over, but he was taken out of the equation relatively early on. We still had to retain the balance, right? I bring this up because one of the things the first game tried to do, and I never really bought it, was that April was not truly the hero. And I never bought that for a second. I mean, yeah, the whole COG thing, I already talked about that, but my point is the Guardian, his whole purpose was to maintain the balance. Once that was done, that's it. He's not here to save the world. That was April's job. And he's not here to save the world again from something that, by all accounts, seems to be a larger scale and more serious threat. He was never the hero. He was just doing his job, his cog in the machine. And he is still doing it now. He has almost no idea what's going on. In fact, it seems like, by all accounts, he gives April terrible advice, which leads to her... Oh yeah, by the way, for those of you who have never actually watched my ruminations, by mere virtue of the fact that this is a rumination analysis on something, obviously I'm going to spoil everything. At least as far as I'm aware of. So, spoilers. April dies, almost as a direct consequence of his advice. She's like, alright, I'm willing to let go. I'll find my cause and work on that. And yet, as is pointed out, the only reason she's so focused on that cause is it's all she has left. There is no doubt whatsoever in my mind, based on the dialogue and based on the actions, that April was, yep, I'm ready to die. Didn't even try to resist it. Nope, go ahead, kill me. It's cool, I'm with it. She was very clearly a death seeker. And that makes sense for her character. But I don't want to talk too much about that just now. What I find most amusing is that Kian felt absolutely not powerless, lackluster, impudent. I don't know. Impotent. Excuse me. He felt like he was just watching the events as he's literally standing there in the midst of them, not doing anything, while civilians are being butchered in the background. And excellent sound design on the people screaming and crying, and the guards saying, "Quick, break down this door so we can murder more innocents." That's not what they're saying, but I mean that was the whole feeling. That whole scene was actually really horrifying. Which I suppose is as good a time as any to talk about the Azadi. Parallels to Nazi Germany are obvious. I'm not going to cover that really. But what I find amusing about the Azadi is they are, in many ways, a very well written and yet nevertheless typical example of a hypocritical regime. You know, their whole, we espouse to the goddess, and we hate magic and magical things because they did not come from the goddess. Oh, but we have magical powered technology. Also, if I may, isn't it funny that Wadi was going for more a biological tech, whereas the Azadi were going more for a technological tech? You know, basically magic-powered steampunk and body-powered computers. Just fun little parallel there. Also, if I may be so bold, for all the magic-powered steampunk they have, ultimately, I personally would not qualify that as magitech, not as I define it. It's, at that point, it's basically just magic. Like, it happens to be magic that moves through gears and metal, but it's still magic. One thing that I do like very much about Kian's inclusion, don't worry, this is related, is the Azadi would come off as Nazis, otherwise. Now, to explain what I mean by that really quick, World War II had a massive, significant impact on our fictional culture. Such is so powerful and so significant that I actually don't think I could underestimate it. I could sit here for the rest of the day and talk to you about the different ways and methods by which World War II has affected our culture. It's huge. World War I, of course, is also related to that, but World War II really codified many, many things about how we think of things, especially when it comes to our fiction. In all forms of it, really, in all forms of medium. This is why I call them Nazis, because the very concept of Nazis has become, at this point, divorced from the actual Nazi party back in World War II. And, of course, just to make sure I'm being 100% clear about this, I'm not referring to Germans when I say the Nazi Party. I'm referring to the Nazi Party. I know some people are still sensitive about that, and I want to make sure that's 100% clear. But the concept of Nazis has nothing to do with that. It is a fictional concept that basically means default bad guys. And I have talked about this several times before on my show. The entire point of a default bad guy is they're evil. The end. There's no complexity. There's no depth. There's no guilt. You can do whatever you want to them. It doesn't matter. It's okay. They're Nazis. You get it? And the very concept of such a default bad guy has become very prolific in fiction. Now, granted, this goes before World War II as well, before anybody accuses me of being stupid. But it has become much more prolific after World War II. The very concept of the Nazi bad guy, the default bad guy, which there's no reason to think about them. There's no culture there. There's no, like, graying out of them. There's no reasons why they're doing that. There's no poor, helpless soul amongst it who's just trying to do his job. No, they're Nazis. They're evil. Moving on. Now, that being said, which gets back to my point, I told you this is all related. One of the things I like about Kian's inclusion is he prevents them from becoming Nazis. We see through him layers, shades of gray, sides of the empire we wouldn't otherwise see. People who are just doing their everyday job, or who aren't terrible, or who actually care about what they're doing. He himself goes through his own character arc. It's rather truncated, but it is still there. Now, this is interesting to me, the way they did this. He never actually loses his faith. He never actually loses his belief, I should say. He still firmly believes in the goddess, whatever the hell that is, and how he should espouse to that. But he starts disagreeing with the organization. He starts to see how the Azadi are utilizing that religion as an excuse to perpetrate what they want to do. And he starts seeing firsthand exactly what is becoming of that. There's a great scene where he starts talking to April, and you're controlling both people. I've already gushed about that scene, but so forgive me for bringing it up again. But the thing I love most about that scene is he gives this wonderful speech about the good the Azadi have brought. And then she immediately counters with the horribleness that the Azadi have brought. I like that because, for me, that really helps the Azadi to be an interesting organization rather than Nazis. We see a people who are, probably closer to Romans, if anything, who have actually brought legitimate benefits and positives to the areas that they have conquered, while at the same time doing horrific, evil things. And I like that, as horrible as that sounds. It would be too easy to make them into benevolent conquerors or purely evil conquerors. Having this in-between helps make them more interesting, which brings me to my next point. Oh, by the way, actually, just to make sure, just so in case I forget to say this, Wadi does the same thing, the Wadi Corporation. We see plenty of decent people at Wadi. We see plenty of in-between people, people just doing their jobs. And then we see plenty of evil people at Wadi. So, same general parallels. And if I may be so bold at this point, I would argue that Wadi and the Azadi are practically the same organization. They may not know it, but I feel like they're doing this, if you know what I mean. So that brings me to my next point. Excuse me. I've mentioned a lot of positives of this game, and I mentioned some negatives of this game, and how I just generally didn't care for it. The story... I like the story of this game. It is very smartly written. There's a lot of greatly written dialogue, and there's a lot of greatly narrative... the narrative structure is very tight, and I like that. But I can't stand the voice acting. I think with maybe the exception of like 3 voice actors, the guy who played Alvin, the guy who played Crow. Wow, is that it? Yeah, with the exception of those 2, maybe the guy who played the obstinate bureaucrat, I don't remember his name, in the tower, or not the tower, in the prison in Arcadia. With the exception of those 3 guys, maybe, the voice acting was very... not good. I don't want to call it actually bad, because as I've said before, I have heard bad voice acting. Bad voice acting is hilarious. But this is just kind of absent voice acting. Actually, the word I want to use is amateur. It felt in a lot of ways that they didn't know what tones to use, and they didn't really know how to emote. So it was just kind of like... And I found myself more and more divorcing myself from what I was hearing and focusing on what I was reading. Because there are several lines which are very powerful and very significant. and then they're read as if someone was reading a thing, and the pauses, they know how to pause for emphasis, but they don't know how long to pace those pauses. And so, the tempo, the tonality of it, and the overall emotion of the voice acting was just generally blah across the entire work. And that is probably my single biggest complaint about the game, and one of the bigger reasons why I found myself just kind of going, the whole time through. Now, granted, Longest Journey had that problem too, but I feel this one had it more. Maybe it's just because this game had so much more emphasis on the dialogue. Huge, huge sections of cutscenes where people are talking for a significant period of time. Let me check my notes. I'm checking my notes here really quick. I want to also talk about... So let's talk about April. I already mentioned how she, obviously the Guardian was not the hero. I already mentioned how she it feels like she gave up. Like she just had no more reason to keep bothering with anything. And that kind of fits with the tone I mentioned back in Longest Journey. Now what? Do I just go home? It's one of my favorite types of stories is now what? And it's a type of story that is actually pretty rarely actually examined because it's difficult to write. You are effectively given a blank sheet of paper when it comes to a now what. All right, you saved the princess, you defeated the dragon, now what? And this feels like a now what for her. She has lost faith. I'm sorry, I hate to keep saying that, but it's true. She's lost faith. She's lost her purpose. She is... I'm circling a point because the next person I want to talk about is Zoe. I don't actually have much to talk about Zoe. Two things I want to mention. First of all, I could be wrong about the timing, but it sounds like about when Faith died is about when Zoe lost her faith. I know. Hear me out. And it felt like that's about the moment at which Zoe kind of started falling into her malaise. Now, that is, of course, quite a bit after April had already fallen into her malaise, and there's no denying that these three characters are connected, along with the Whitekin. I'm not sure of the exact connection, but it certainly feels like there's a connection there. But I mention that because that is arguably one of the biggest themes of the work, and it's way overemphasized. I mentioned the good writing. Well, that actually isn't 100% true. The one thing they don't do well is... In Longest Journey, most of the themes were undercurrent, which in my opinion is what a theme should be. You should have it kind of flowing in the background. That is my opinion, of course. One of the things that I loved about Guardians of the Galaxy 2, there's no spoilers here, is the undercurrent scenes, which helped emphasize the theme of family. One of my least favorite parts of Guardians of the Galaxy 2 was the incredibly blatantly overt scenes, which emphasized the theme of family. I don't like it when you shove it into my face like I'm an idiot. I prefer to actually think about it and be like, oh, right? Dreamfall really treated me like I was an idiot. It kept hammering in the point over and over and over about how several of the main characters feel like they're lacking in purpose. They don't know their place. They don't know where they fit in the machine. They don't know which cog they are, right? They don't know what they're... I like that theme. It's just a little bit too overt. I do like how it weaves through just about every character to some extent or another. Virtually every character's arc in this story, all of the ones who have any major level of dialogue, is all about them finding their place. Which part of the machine does their cog fit into? And Zoe and April, of course, are the overt, obvious ones. But we see this in Crow. We see this in, oh God, the mage dude who reformed. I can't think of his name. Roper Clax, I think? We see that in him, how he's trying to find his new place in the world. We see that in Kian, who he's trying to find his place in the world. In virtually every character, to some extent or another, they are trying to find their place, their purpose. In some cases, they have found it and are assured in it. And a lot of the characters who are absolutely certain of their place in the universe without questioning it, that's important, are evil. Alvin Peats is an excellent example of that, actually, who was actually well voice acted and absolutely disgusting in like every way. Oh my God, what the hell? Ew, ew, ew. That being said, praise to the design of Alvin Peats. Not only the writing was excellent, The voice acting, for once, was actually quite good. Not amazing, but it was certainly good. And the design of him fits perfectly. We have seen several times in fiction the idea of someone using technology to extend their life way past when it should. And I don't mean in a good way, a clean way. I mean in a what that would probably actually entail in real life way. Slowly replacing the body as it slowly necrotizes and gets past the point where it can sustain itself kind of a way. Fallout New Vegas did that with Mr. House, for example. And I'm not going to go into other examples. But this is actually one of my favorite examples. The idea of this distended, warped, mutated human who is so necrotized and so filled with machinery that he literally can't see or hear anymore unless he's hooked into devices that beam information directly into whatever's left of his brain. That was awesome. And the idea of that being what is necessary to survive that long is kind of a cool idea. And also kind of goes along with one of the few undercurrent themes of this work, which I'm going to discuss now. The theme of letting go. Or, to be more clear about that, the theme of having faith. Now see, the reason I have to sigh there is because the faith thing is just a little bit too obvious, and the fact that they literally named a character Faith just kind of makes you raise an eyebrow. I do note that there's a lot of points of dialogue where they mention the word faith, and if you insert the name Faith in place of the word faith, it still makes equal sense, if not even more sense. But the theme of actually having to have faith in things is one of the undercurrent themes of the work as a whole so far. That was actually one of the major themes back in Longest Journey, right? Believing in something. Well, it's here too. But in this case, it's not so much believing in something so much as feeling and thinking that things can and will work out, even if you don't know how or why. And that brings me to my second point about Zoe. While I found her to be a relatively disinteresting character, I have to note, mostly because of the overtness of her presentation, I have to note that she obviously is someone who is a decent person inside. This is someone who, by all accounts, in most fictional works, hell, in real life, would be a snob. Like Zack back in the last game, right? She has money. She has no requirements and no responsibilities. She can do whatever the hell she wants to, and yet she tries to help people regularly and consistently. She's intelligent. She's sharp. The only thing she was really lacking was a will, the drive to go forward. But you could argue rather strongly that she actually has faith. I'm saying this wrong. That she develops faith over the course of the game. That she gets to the point where she stops being frustrated about what she can't do and starts accepting what she can do in the hopes that that will lead to things being better in the future. Right? Now, the funny thing is, I mention that because this is one of the subtler points of the work. She has this arc where she's slowly building her faith. Kian has an arc where he reinvigorates his existing faith. He himself actually says this overtly, which is the only downside of his arc, I'd say. He says, and he is a trite, he was worried that he was questioning his faith, that all of the things he was saying was making him think that he was wrong. But in truth, it was actually not that at all. It was that he was right all along. He was just looking at it from the wrong angle. He was presenting it in the wrong angle. He was allowing his faith to be corrupted by politics. Please no politics in my channel. You get it though, right? He was allowing an organization to utilize his faith. And he comes to reinvigorate his faith. And that brings us to April, who loses her faith over the course of the game. So she goes up, he stays in the middle, and she goes down. Rather balanced, isn't it? Like I said, that's one of the more subtle, nice themes of the work, which I rather enjoyed. Looking at my notes here, I already talked about Westhouse, I already talked about Kian. Two more points, and then I'm going to chop this off. First of all, let's talk about Faith. Now, as the character. Now, as I already mentioned, this game didn't really do much for me. I basically had to have a filter over my brain the entire game to really extract the significance of the work. Because, again, it's like I practically could have just played it on mute and just read the lines, and that might have worked better. With all sincerity, I probably should have actually done that. But that might have affected the rumination, so I didn't want to do that. But there was one scene that really got to me, emotionally, that gut-punched me. And that is everything to do with the finale with Faith, the character. Oh my god. Oh. Whoa. That's messed up. That is way, way messed up. Hi, we've just basically built you, probably grew you in a lab, and left you locked up into a tiny room without access to sun or activity or other people of any significance, and we're basically destroying any possibility you ever have of being a fully fleshed out person, in addition to ruining your life that you have. Oh, and also you're probably going to die soon because of health issues. Oh, and then we're going to murder you. But it's okay, because then you'll exist on in such a way that will literally cause devastation on a global scale. So you now have to kill yourself, or allow yourself to be killed. I'll accept either interpretation, in order to save everyone. What the crap? And if you don't understand the significance of that, I want you to picture right now someone that you care about. Doesn't matter who. Someone you really care about. And they've just been through the ringer. Okay? They've been through hell. And after going through all that, and they endure all that, now you have to sit there and you take their hand and it's like, look, you need to die. Tell me that wouldn't get some kind of significant emotional response out of you. Because it did out of me. I had to pause the game. I was crying too hard. Because I was picturing real people in my real life, and me having to go through that with them. And I couldn't deal with it. My defense was to not think about it. Couldn't do it. That was too much. So that hit hard. Holy crap. I really hope there is something like an afterlife in this setting, because goddamn, if there's karma, for example, that girl deserves like golden, awesome paradise of wonderness after what she's been through. But this actually leads me to my final thought. And I actually have one other thing I want to mention really quick in related to this. You'll notice the game begins with Westhouse, right? I've already kind of given all my speculation about him. But the game also ends on Westhouse. Again, that whole cyclical thing that these games seem to like. One of the things that I feel is another undercurrent, probably foreshadowing rather than a theme of this work, is the idea that there's a difference between implementation, that it matters what you use something for rather than just what something is. There's a little bit of that in the first game, the idea that chaos it can be good or bad, and that order can be good or bad, depending on how you use it. But I feel like that because we see different aspects of Westhouse in this game than we did in the previous one, and we can see how he is being presented and how he is using whatever it is that's available to him in different ways, just like everyone else is, actually. We can see what it's like when the Azadi use their power for good, and we can see what it's like when the Azadi use their power for evil. And I'm not going to name all the other examples. They're fairly self-evident. But I have a feeling that that was such an undercurrent thing that I'm wondering if that's going to come up in the third game at all. And if that has anything to do with the undreaming, because if, this is raw speculation at this point, what if the undreaming is actually isn't the unlife or whatever, but is in fact dreams used for an ill purpose? Because isn't exactly what the dream console does, is uses your dreams for an ill purpose rather than a good one? Anyways, no more speculation. I am curious to see the third one. I just found out relatively recently that the third game just finished coming out, like, less than a year ago, actually, at this point. I didn't realize it was that recent, so it'll be interesting to see where they've gone with this. I wonder if they'll ever make a fourth one. Either way, I'll see you next time, guys.